Yeah, formally, game theory is a branch of mathematics that studies how to make the optimal strategic choice under uncertainty to win a game, starting with in two-player zero-sum games like chess or the Cold War. And it was formalized kind of in the World War II era. There was a book written by von Neumann, the great physicist, mathematician, thinker, and a guy named Morgenstern on game theory and economics. And it's interesting that it was those two together because so much of how our economic system works is based on the same concepts. Game theory has been happening forever. It wasn't called game theory, it's just called strategy, right? It's just we hadn't been able to apply some of the tools of math and computation that were able to be applied at that time. But if you're reading Sun Tzu or you're reading Machiavelli or you're reading any kind of general discussing military strategy, they're basically talking about how do you win a rivalrous game where you don't know what the opponent is doing. Where obviously, depending upon what they're doing, some moves would be great moves, some moves would be terrible moves. Obviously, this is chess. This is any kind of game dynamic like that. The most famous first study in game theory that many people have heard of is the prisoner's dilemma. And I won't describe the prisoner's dilemma in detail here. People can check it out online. But the idea is you and a buddy are both in jail. You're both being investigated. You're both being given a plea type option. If you both cooperate with not kind of ratting each other out, it's the best solution for both of you. But if the other guy rats you out and you don't, it's the worst solution for you personally. And if you end up ratting on the other guy and he doesn't, it's less bad for you than if you both kind of keep the dynamic. And so what is found out is that under the uncertainty where you don't know what the other guy is going to do, the tendency is to assume the worst and move into a position of kind of maximum selfishness, maximum rivalry. You can imagine in situations of warfare, if you don't know how much armament the other guy has, you don't know how aggressive their interests are, you want to assume the worst case scenario and try to plan to be able to win under the worst case scenario, which ends up meaning, and the other guy is doing the same thing. If, let's say, they're offering an agreement, but you know they might defect on their agreement, which happens all the time, right? Stalin and Hitler were participating when it was serving both of their interests, and then Hitler defects on Stalin when it's not aligned with his interests. So in game theory, there's something called a coordination game, which is you actually don't compete against someone. You coordinate with them when it's in your interest to coordinate, but then you reserve the right to defect on them when that's in your interest. Not just in military situations. You see that in, say, class dynamics. The upper class might all coordinate with each other with regard to tax policies for the upper class, while simultaneously competing for who has positions of maximum power within that class. A whole industry, like, say, the AI sector or oil, might coordinate with each other for getting the regulations they want for the sector, while then all competing for who has the most market share. So under a game theoretic scenario, there is no such thing as allies for real. There is no such thing as like friends or loyalty. There's frenemies at best. And the frenemy scenario is, as long as we have shared interests, I can expect a certain degree of cooperation. As soon as we don't have shared interests, I can expect defection. So we're continuously planning for selfishness and defection. And that takes up also a huge amount of bandwidth. This ends up explaining a tremendous amount about how the world works, militarily, economically, politically, diplomatically, where we're making an agreement while assuming the other guy will defect, while they are assuming we will defect. We're trying to figure out how to spy on their defection while being able to confuse their spies, and those types of dynamics are a huge amount of the coordination failures of the world. And there are some things that game theory and game theoretic thinking, even before it was formalized in math, the formalization of it just made it much more powerful and much more ubiquitous. And now you can run it on computers and run it on AI. So we can see AI being able to run those types of models beats humans at chess, beats humans at Go, beats humans at StarCraft, now is increasingly beating humans at more generalized things like obviously trading, economic trading, and even comprehensive war planning and targeting of missiles and all those things. So one type of game theoretic scenario that defines a lot of properties of the world is If there are a number of players, number of actors, let's call it tribes or countries or companies or whatever, and one of them does something that provides a lot of near-term advantage for them, it might be doing something particularly destructive. Like, say, let's take an early kind of tribal analogy. Rather than only taking what they need from nature, they're starting to cut down a lot more timber to be able to create surplus. And you have a scenario where they can then use that surplus in different ways to be able to win at tribal warfare. So now you take the other tribes. If they don't do the same thing, it doesn't protect the forest because the other guy's going to cut down the forest anyways. And if they don't do the same thing, they might not even be able to protect their people. And so now, even if they didn't want to, they have to race to cut down the forest faster just for their own need to survive. And so you get this scenario where there's kind of a race to exploit the commons. And whether that's fishing or hunting or, any kind of exploitation from the environment, oil. So you have a situation called the tragedy of the commons, which is a kind of social trap is one of the terms, or multipolar trap, where the net scenario of what everyone is racing to do makes the worst possible world for everyone, but nobody can stop it, because if anyone stops, it's so much worse for them in the short term, and they can't assure that the other guy's not going to do it. And so the idea that because they are doing it, we have to, you end up having a world that nobody wants, but nobody feels they can choose otherwise. And this is such a deep thing to understand because, like, let's say you take any of the major environmental issues of the time. I'm going to take climate change because probably most of your listeners think that's a thing. For those who don't, you can apply it to species extinction or chemical pollution or any of these issues. Literally nobody actually wants climate change. Like, there's no one for whom climate change is their strategic objective. And yet, and the whole world actually, in terms of the G20, the United Nations, all of the major countries of the world have acknowledged climate change is a major issue. We all want to stop it. There's $1 trillion in climate-related funding happening every year. There's the IPCC having huge supercomputers supported by NASA and NOAA. There's international agreements. And yet every single year we use more fossil fuels than the year before. All of the renewables, all of the solar, all of the everything, we haven't even slowed the rate of increase of fossil fuel use. And so we obviously don't know how to stop climate change. Everybody thinks that it's a particularly bad thing. The UN estimates that about 1 billion refugees from extreme weather events and climate change will happen in the next decade. And the world has no way to deal with 1 billion refugees. And so we can't stop it, and yet nobody wants it. What they want is energy for every other purpose, and that's one of the side effects of it. And no one feels that they could price energy properly or be able to consume less, because let's say the US priced energy properly, meaning it right now we price oil as how much it costs us to extract it from the ground plus a tiny margin, not what it took nature to make or what it would take for us to clean up the environmental effects. So obviously most of the costs are externalized to the environment. If we were to start to try to price it more properly so that you could produce it in a way that didn't have the negative environmental effects, but say China didn't, then they would have more margins than us. They would beat us. That's the multipolar trap. And the same happens in arms races, the advancement of military tech. If they're making AI drone weapons and the AI drone weapon is going to comprehensively outperform the weapons that are run by humans, then we have to make AI drone weapons. And if we don't know exactly what type they're making, we have to assume. We have to spy on them, obviously, and we have to run counter intel on their spies. But we also have to assume that they're making all of the worst possible ones, plus defenses, and try to get comprehensive advantage, allocate larger and larger military budgets. And you get a world in which there is increasing destructive power with nuclear weapons, cyber weapons, hypersonic delivery of nuclear weapons, drone weapons, etc. And again, literally nobody wants to live in the world with AI drone weapons. But also no one feels that they can stop it. And so this multiplayer game theoretic dilemma, where under uncertainty, you assume the worst case scenario, you race ahead. The net result is this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, is the other guy does do that thing, whether he was going to or not, because he thinks you're going to, and you're saying the only reason you are is because you think they are. And the world you end up getting is maximum environmental destruction, maximum weapons, maximum distrust, etc.